Just warming them up. And myself too. I'm Rody. Remove the island. Yeah. What's he doing? Where is he? Schmoozing. Pressing. Fish. Okay.
set up over here a bit, have we? Yeah, I guess with the... Yeah, okay. Cheers. Gonna Shiv? So, an bhfuil míad réig don sesiún úntaach seo ina meg tror scríóirí nó allantóirí den sco ag dul in our mask. So we'll have this session, will feature three wonderful artists. Agus chuir mé an bhirt, céad bhirt I bhór láir reducebara, mar bheidh siad ag déanamh sais chorá adartha. I'll introduce the first two together because they'll be doing sort of dialogue, and then I'll come back and I'll introduce the third and final performer. So, our engaged dulcius, Rody Gorman, a rugach im Mackay, so it's Mackay, okay. Kega Wilche na Coney, or Ilonski, Skihanok, Communishkel, on the Isle of Skye, Ilonski Hanok, the Tamil Fada and Nish. So, the Isle of Skye seems like an appropriate location for this insular Celt who exhibits no insularity at all in his literary output and outlook. Tá annacuid leabhar scríofa aige I Nuailin, I Merle, agus Darnoe I Nalig na Halban freisin. He's written numerous books in English, Irish, and Scots Gaelic. His writing exhibits a Joycean, to my mind and to my ear, play with language in both translation and original texts, a punning, refractive, fractalesque, boring into meaning, and turning up strange currents and currencies. Agus in Iheonta, like Alistair, Mackay, who's going to be playing the short Scots pipes and whistles. Am I correct in that? That's the right designation. Alistair is a musician with heritage from both Scotland and Ireland. So we can discuss that perhaps a little later. Ach, idús bara, cuairgí fáilte ribh Alistair agus Rody le bhrdul.
Bealach a chrí, bealach a linn, bealach an thunig, bealach cud in na círsce, bealach et a davhain, bealach a glíne, bealach garab, ben na creiche, ben dú a bhealich, ben na canich, ben na gréine, ben na neon, ben na lochan, ben na chalich, Croch na fiach, croch na cuaice, croch lehan, croch glach nuachroch, croch continue, croch go chlachan, croch go schoolmen, cud a fúr, cud erachar, cud in na cíche, cud in na círsce, cud in na lug, cud a ré, cud a vati, lach an hecharan, lach an clach, lach an yeski, lach an yima, lach an linje, lach an yelen, lach na lua. Skur an yesan gil, skur an yetan, skur a chasha, skur na hullerja, skur schoolman, skur na fiug, skur na kurach. Chunnel na manian, go clean mar fopple. Na mar allan na gael, a visca shine, and feel na shrin na down, man was second heen, gasul na sul, amen. Assembly of hills, gathered together like a congregation, or the collection Carmina Gadelica, chanted in the presence of the Most High, in my own Parnassus, life without end, amen. Hi. This one. Myself and Alistair go back a long time. We met together when we went to university in Aberdeen 25 years ago, I suppose. And Alistair's background is distinctly Gaelic, as well as Billy mentioned, being Scottish and Irish, and that his father is a native Gaelic speaker from quite an isolated Gaelic-speaking community in Glenshiel and Kintail in the Scottish mainland. And his mother comes from the Eris, Gaeltacht and County Mayo, equally remote in the geographical and linguistic sense. So we've worked together as a sort of a pan-Gaelic partnership, but this is the first time we've performed in a formal setting like this. So the next poem relates to the classical music called Kilmore. Perhaps after it, Alistair might give a more detailed explanation about the significance of Kilmore. I'll read the poem first. Dwy reitach a chwmel, béal an tethe, chud a hain gleis. Gafa Kilmore, dan a bhail áhar, a bheith dúrach bhuaso. Anal is teachas amach fat na títe, túr lán a tína syndrom. Ad sa bhain na hesu, liolach go háist agus cach nan tost mar badúil, balav, hanige gamusi. Chuddig chulach venavas than upasha galir. After the reitach, DJ Lamont goes off to tune the pipes and plays a Kilmore for everyone. Breath in and out, full of ornamentation and Athena syndrome. As he stands out over there in classical pose, blowing away everyone else, observing due silence, it strikes one. A tiny wee midgie could ruin all of this. Maybe I'll... So also, do you want to give a brief description of what Kilmore is all about?
I'll try. Hello, Feskama. Good evening. As Rody was saying in the poem there, Kilmore. Obviously, a lot of Irish speakers here probably understand what that means. The great music in Scottish Gaelic. That's the classical music of the pipes. The tune I just played there to go with Rody's poem there actually goes back to the 17th century. It's quite an ancient tune. These tunes were actually taken from the bardic tradition, in fact. In Highland society, the bards, just like here in Ireland, was a very privileged position, and the Highland chiefs are often patrons to these bards. And bardic schools existed in Scotland as it did in Ireland. And often the bards collaborated with the pipers. The pipers was another privileged position in the Highland courts. And in Skye, in particular, there is a very famous piping family called the McCrimmons. These were the pipers to the MacLeods of Dunvegan. And they had their own piping school, just like a bardic school. And it used to say, they say that pipers from all around Scotland used to come to get taught by these Macremmers. It's taken 7 years to perfect their art. But these ancient tunes have come down to us, down to modern day. A lot of competitions in Scotland, these Kilmore or Pibrach, obviously Pibrach being the Gaelic for piping, these competitions still exist. I was very lucky to be taught by a man called Tony MacDonald, or Anthony MacDonald. He was a Gaelic speaker from Lochaber, and he'd been taught in turn by a piper, who in turn had been taught all the way back to the Macremmons. So these tunes are passed down in the oral tradition. And the way they used to pass them on was using a system called counterach, which means to sing. So you had to sing the melody rather than look at the notes. And that makes more sense if you actually think about music, that you actually learn the nuances of the music by singing rather than looking at the notes. And so that's the tradition of piping as such. But in many respects, as I say, going back to these bardic schools in the Highlands, the music that was composed was originally put on the harp, on the clarsach, and the bard would sing along these ancient melodies. And so when in the 17th century rules were brought in, just like the statutes here in Ireland, the statutes of Kilkenny, we had the statutes of Iona in Scotland, this put the end of the Highland society, of these Highland courts and these bardic schools. So a lot of these ancient songs were actually transposed onto the pipes. So a lot of the movements that we use are actually taken from the harp, trying to replicate the ripple sound you would get on the harp. And that's how it works, basically. So, and these tunes would last about 20 to 30 minutes in length, so it's quite a piece of work. And that style of music, which is a basic theme that builds up to a crescendo, actually existed in Scotland and in Ireland 150 years before European classical music, which uses the same sort of formula. So even though we're very much in the periphery of Europe today, culturally, Ireland and Scotland was very much at the centre a few hundred years ago, and perhaps back today. So I'll hand back over to Rody.
Now you know. The other thing, another thing myself and Alistair have in common is that we both belong, well, in a sense, to the historical part of Ireland called Cuala. I was brought up in Churchtown in Dublin, and Alistair's got relations down the road in Terranure, Temple Oak, Kimmage, Crumlin sort of area. And I wrote a series a few years ago of short tercets. I won't call them haiku, but I call them three-liners, relating to the historical and contemporary area of Cuala, which really extends from the Liffey all the way down to Arklow and takes in most of South County Dublin and most of County Wicklow. And they're largely suburban and rural. I'll just read one or two of them. And I don't know, have you got any haiku piping there, Alistair, that would help? No? No? That could be a first as well. Haiku piping, See? Fad maverk o Sean Bray, ni hanan zirach agus in ye, a weird yawn in a bonsai. As far as I can see from Bray Head, not exactly straight up like it was yesterday, the Irish Sea dead calm. Gon Lewis her broads, sitzen diljogin, gun fuim dalaid, totsu, and Lewis said a throws. The Lewis goes throat past fast, a leaflet falls without the slightest sound, totsu, down onto the street. A law agol an muile, achfos, gerahan a graine, as Cian war na cuille. The day getting slow late, but still all those sunbeams above Barnaculla. Irash garin the mara, mar an always among snowba, nach Kivenlat, the chara. Back to Sea Point, where we used to go and swim, Don't you remember, my old friend? Far they cush a chuan, guach craw a bains na ngruan, leis a lochen siluan. A man foot beside the curved bay on Sandymount Strand, looking for cockles at first light on Monday. Wirfin, the solas buan, the tachten all a goon criffin, a tib hall gun chuan. On Marion Strand, the light that never goes out coming from the bailey on the other side of the curved bay. Gan on ach me hain sa bhéinin, ach loch me hain na lósin, rá chil inin lénin. Just myself in the selfie I took that day on the beach at Calaini. Ash a bork chlán malura lá lonrach, mar hug na rovers bu amach, buat ella Green Conrach. Back again in Glenmalure Park on a glorious Sunday, where rovers beat drums another hour time. Fall agus ballagair, heart a lóhart a malatir, mar an ógmid the bains na smear. A field wall hedge and a sharp smell round about the Presence Place in Ballantyre, where we used to go and pick smear blackberries. A fannach leis amos, gan chinne, nocht an sé go hitte gaiche, she's fa sroes na tinne. Waiting for the bus, suddenly it naked appears with a chit-sheet gust all the way down Fleet Street. So that's one or two little vignettes about cool, historic and contemporary, selfies and all. I was in Cork. Put the hand quick, Amsami, Mahakastu. Amsami, and you the Dulcher Statsami on he. Get a hook and a sign of So Alistair can do freestyle anytime he can come in and out as he chooses. Yeah. I was lucky enough years ago to be the writer in residence at UCC, and it sort of brought me back, amongst other things, to writing in Irish, which I hadn't done for a long time, because I'd been away from an Irish-speaking environment in the Isle of Skye, and in a Gaelic environment, and it became very confusing in my mind for a long time between the two languages, and took me a long time to be able to make a reasonable effort at compartmentalizing them. But yeah, so that brought me back to Irish, and I'm reminded of one poem from that period relating to that time and relating to the locality, Emma Green. Sheenam amach, agus laim sheer, peace Emma Green, a lagan fowder, is a radio gechush na lappa, sa shul laguni, leis a wuam a brishamach, is a rash is teach wi shach, may it situm a hul fingi, mober hain, ultra helm, as a carrig enert, agus na skigidi. I stretch out and lie back on my back at home and sleep a wink, with the radio by the bed going all the time, with sound breaking in and out turns about, as I'm drifting to leeward and following my own inclination, on altar helm between the Faroes and Fastnet. Hey, Alistair. I'm reminded that it's 70 years since the evacuation of the Great Blasket. I think it was this month, in 1953. Am I right? Some years ago, I wrote a sequence based on a book by Willis McCunnell about the Blaskets, and because of where I was at the time, it came out in Gaelic first. This is it. This is one verse in Gaelic, and then rendered into Irish and English. Bohran the Marav, a sheen na chasan go clatach, a gynyon of a tav an sagalav, sachai a yulan har a vialich, and loch gashik a dolgachi, and seichin a nul go calag, talu trochger leis a yalich, is a horag nurshin van talu. Burin the maru a casa, shees in a chosan go cladach, Gantrom ddion sa wala sa cuidir siar haar farige, in the warantori a gimach the wala, in a good nebo go coolness kala, it hollad sedum lesh in yalach, sin the year shin in year, the dollar. The boring of the dead winds down to the shore, a pathway for the ones who were there and are gone, and were transported over the sound, like the ferrymen going home in their currachs across the bay, by moonlight to dry land, and then placed face down in the ground. So that was just an image from, and a place name, from Willis McCunnell's very visually striking account of the Blaskets. Will I hain or shan with the Kindergarten hain, Alistair? Yeah, do you have a sound? Gee, do you have the Oh, yeah. Yeah, and you speak do you have? So this is a tune that Alistair wrote about a friend of ours, a man who died this year called Donald Cameron, who was a great tradition bearer from the island of North Uist, and who was involved to a great degree in collection of lore and broadcasting. He was a very distinguished radio producer at the BBC, and a great tradition bearer generally. And this is Alistair's personal tribute, which accompanied or complemented a lament that I wrote. I don't have the English, in fact I don't have the Gaelic, but this is Alistair's tune, which he calls Dal and Crualatar, which means, well, Donald the broadcaster, Donald of the airwaves. Hey, Alistair. Do it. I was recently awarded a grant to write poems relating to Cape Clear, which I really must visit very soon. The last time I set foot in Cape Clear was in 1968. You didn't hear that, did you? So, true to form, I've used this sort of tercet form. I don't know if you noticed in the previous ones that I was reading that I have used strict rhyme, like so-called technically perfect full rhyme, in the Gaelic and the Irish versions I was reading, and I've done the same thing here. I suppose it's just an exercise and a sort of a discipline I've imposed upon myself. But I've also used sometimes very lengthy single words to translate combined words to translate a single word in either Gaelic or Irish. I'll explain that a wee bit later, but in the meantime, I call it intertonguing. There's a good reason for that. But I'll get back to that. And so these are a couple of trial pieces really about Cape Clear in the absence of not having been there for 55 years. And my sources are, to a large degree, literary, because the corpus of the literature of Cape Clear, it's maybe not quite as considerable as that of the Blaskets. There are some still wonderful books that came out of it, and one of them in particular is Seanachas Cléirte by Groarke, which came out in the 1930s, but relates a lot to the life of a fishing community at the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th. It's very interesting as social history as well as, beautiful Irish. And then more latterly, Donnacha Hamish O'Driscoll and his writings, which, were fostered in the Irish Times through Eileen O'Brien and were collected in a couple of forms, and his observations of island life. And we tend to think that we live on an island. We don't. We live on a huge block in the middle of the ocean, which is 80 miles long. Now, this contrasts quite a lot with Cape Clear, which is 3 miles by 1.5. And yet, within that small little cosmos, such wonderful literature emerged in the case of Groarke and Donnacha Hamish, and then scholarly work by people like Brendan O'Buchala. So a lot of the purities of the dialect have been preserved in literary or academic form. So I'm using these unashamedly literary sources in the meantime, and I'll get to Cape Clear soon enough, I hope. Ekuna day, a fara de hir nuain, fiach shauka following agus o shiachain, is o kirtagoin, they kurdan kuain. Forever watching for the opportune time moment in the weather, look, a hawk circling, and Sheehan and Cadogan waiting to clear the harbour for the open sea. Shul na guas Lonag Rakke, Feich, a Dirskolach, it's a Shiachonach and Akke, it's a Tachtarnash, and Fod na Fwacke. Walking on a journey in the hollow coves, on the track, looking for wrack and all that flotsam and jetsam. Look, O'Driscoll and Sheehan, and coming back with not a stick or a sod. Stadam Stockon, crush na Geradrian, a drill edish Lenelin, och, emacht na Mlian. I stop at a stump at the crossroads where they used to go in their day. Och, the passage of the years. Taif Shean Shead Worm, howl the hear to us, och Rakanach of Hig, because a Douglas, a shul na Ganocus, a Kurdach, na Glabadonus, na Goose. They're forever appearing like ghosts over there from Crochan and Achadhig, Kus Douglas, walking on a journey in the hills and searching the hollow rocks and ruins and coves. The Heenwo McGrover, Tree the Goon, Dún and Nord, a Kid Lord and over. I see over there ploughing through the harbour, the Dún and Nord, on the first day of autumn. East, Huikoch, Gladron is gone. It's a log and loose galeen the known, o chus na bulige, o chus and yon. Listen, All those seabirds on a day without a sound or a ripple, from Cwys na Bwyllige to Cwys and Yon. Arim is ní léir dom pin vrech, edr a cynlín is crocán chyddi, cynlún a cyn leis is the glech. I hear and feel and can't see under the raging heather, between cynlín and crocán chyddi, a chaffinch calling and crying out. Agus yn Calinord, a dull heart find I dawn more, the Gurta Darta, Sholtor. The ferry goes past the headland, suddenly a basking shark. Carrigan Eishk, Foilán a Fui, the horde sy drodanach Bosti, agus a fraggart, Ganyain a Key. On Carrigan Eishk, a seagull crying out lied high up in the drizzle, and a gannet calling out in response. So these are apprentice pieces really about Cape Clear for the time being. And I'd also like to offer a couple of versions in Scottish Gaelic of some of the great Cork poets no longer with us, starting with Sean Riordan. This is Gaelic. Van Baas dim Hoove, Guntich me Fallov, Gun Viles gun Ranich, Gami gan Vis Hain le Unug, Burt Nidrim Heen, agus bin me Heen Gutur, Och Sonny Slán mar sin lat Hain a Luchan. Smidi Shout in your ash, Edunur at an ish, a Hannig a Maas, Gam Yusi na Yaun, Snachro Agam Ed, Ach Gaedig Rish, Sula me gan Hickin, and Huivness of his Nian, a stool Eichgadi Lenan, get na Helmi Banan. Death was at my shoulder. I said I'd go without a fight, without any big to-do, self-analyzing. All I could do was ponder and wonder. I said, and that was me off to a tee. Och well, cheerio then, you poor wee thing. Looking back today to the time that Mr. Death came for me in a mad hurry and left me no choice but give up the ghost, I think I can appreciate the joy of a young woman waiting for Mr. Right to come, though feminine side I have none. Yeah. And this is Sean O'Tuama in Gaelic. He wrote a cheart Grian Thor, a cheart Uske, a Golav agus Clishke Odra, and Bruch na Hainu, a bound do na Ruag na Min a Vai, ach Mirvulach Mór, agus Bracht le Or, se Ian Ursel, a house Gach Ian, Fun a Grain, Fesker 4. Autumn sunlight. The water hen, startled by the riverbank, was not black nor brown nor stunted, but miraculously great and golden. Every bird has fine feathers under the sunlight of an afternoon in autumn. And Michael Davitt, Hiraeth. Tust seo as joy a vóch, is a lóri faltgug san avin, etter solas is beel na heiche. The scaragal nach clun dinne, san eiche ri tuchtjum glaun glaun, a corstich san uch. This quiet after song, as day dips in the river between light and twilight, the scream no one hears, and night comes down, valley by valley, barking in the cold. And of the last of the Cork poets no longer with us, I don't have an English version for this, but this is by Liam O'Midrilla. Rán. Beleshglum a golanav, mar horag edanam, agus cynniw am lôn. Noch giheen suas a machas a word, a gragad a rán, a cud ga na brain. Culach a fis, is huich a smig bri lár, no a charas lugi ye, bri a tón. Di leshgaram, dolla snov, mar jaul an aum is a cynna lôn. noch tí hain a níos as an isce, a rá go raibh rón stig há clipú, tar agus tócha, agus hit a smig go talamh nó ar a laid, ar a líd, go dtí na tón. Alistair, is there anything you want to add to what you've said, or anything you want to talk about, Alistair?
So tonight I've been trying to think of some tunes that are applicable for the Isle of Skye and where we live and the local area. And so I'm going to play a wee tune just now on the one of the whistles here. It's called Callum's Road. It was a tune that was composed in the 1980s by a guy called Donald Shaw of Capically fame, if you know who they are. And it was about a man called Callum MacLeod. He was from the island of Rody, which is just off the Isle of Skye. Rody is quite a small place in comparison to Skye, but still a reasonably sized island. There's about 200 people living there. But in the 1970s and 80s, it was very much a dying community. And parts of the island were quite remote. And so to try and keep the island, I suppose, alive and to keep the community together, this man, Callum, wanted to connect his village to the rest of the island. The only way to get to his village was to walk across the hills. And so he started to build a road. He applied several times to Highland Council to try and get a road built, but they just said there wasn't the money. There was no point trying to rescue that particular community. He was quite a stubborn man, so he went out with a pick and a shovel and a wheelbarrow, and he started to build this road. Now, if you ever go to Rasi, you can actually drive on the road now. It's quite incredible because it goes all the way up the hill and down and around and everything else. It goes through rock and bog and everything. And this poor man, pretty much every day for about 20 years, went out, all weathers, to build this road to connect his community to the rest of the island. So this is a tune called Callum's Road. So I've been working on a version of the narrative of Mad Sweeney, Willa Hivna, since specifically February 2012. And it's high time something was done about it. And I've done the final proof, I think, last week. I think it's the final proof. And I don't really want to let go of it. But this is what happens. Things become books and then bye-bye. Anyway, there's a lot of things going on in the Sweeney things, which might explain why it's taken me 12 years to knock it into the shape I want. You're familiar with the story, Willa Hivna, early modern Irish romance about basically a petty king who's cursed and goes mad and lives a hermetic sort of life, living on mainly watercress and water. That's in a nutshell. It's taken me 12 years
to get to that sentence. It's taken me 12 years to condense it down to that sentence. But there's a few things going on in the version I'm doing. As you might guess, I'm leaping between Gaelic and Irish and English. And I'm also mixing them up in the thing I call lingua gadelica, right? So one line might be, half a line might be in Irish, the next half in Gaelic, vice versa. Confused. And then a thing called intertonguing. I think I might mention this before. Now, intertonguing is the English translation of the Gaelic for translation. Did you get that? The Gaelic for translation is eterhengahu. How does that translate into English? Intertonguing. So intertonguing means taking a simple, in many cases, Gaelic or Gaelic word, which has multiple meaning. You go to Dineen's dictionary for Irish and you go to Dwelly's dictionary for Gaelic, and you'll sometimes find 20 equivalents of one word, which can be very confusing or very rewarding, depending on your point of view. I've taken the second attitude, you know? So, for example, the word shul in Gaelic, S-I-U-B-H-A-L, the spelling tends to be more conservative in Scottish Gaelic, and sounds tend to have been preserved that have fallen out of use in Irish. Shul might mean traveling, or it might mean seeking something, or it might mean dying. Now, if you combine those, you can get death seek walking, or seek walk dying, depending on context, you know? Or you might get death walk seeking. So you've got three meanings of the one word. So I thought, well, rather than choose one, why not combine them all? Why not show what's going on? Show the person who is goidelically challenged what exactly is going on in the original language. Yeah? So there's a lot of that intertonguing stuff in this Sweeney narrative. It's what's called a prosimetric tale, meaning half of it's in prose and half in verse, although probably more in verse. Here's an example. Now, also, you can jazz this up as you wish, you know, or you can refuse to participate, but there's something very jazzy about the language. Ronan went back wester. No, he didn't. Ronan went back west after that to Moira to engage in the peace process between Donald Mackay, Hanbury from Dungay, viz. King of Ireland, and squint-eyed Congo MacScanlan from Clane, King of Ulster, but he couldn't peacify them, so there was no deal. The altar boy cleric would be brought, however, as a frith and grith patronage security between them every lay day, so that not one apparition person would be dead killed from the hour time the temptation-longing cat battalion batting would be mischief stopped to when they were tip-cat permitted again. But Sweeney would temerate the security protection of Ronan the go-between otter boy cleric, and exceeded his handpart before rising mealtime every day for every fairy forgiveness piece and relic truce Aeronicum that Ronan would make. He would dead kill a man before the mealtime of the fight every lay day, and another man at the final rock pinnacle / cessation every noon evening. On the day it was step surpassed determined to give due boast great cat battalion battle royal, Sweeney came into the theatre ahead of all the others. He was decorated like this: a filmy tulle silk Alps shirt next to his bright white handsome body skin, and a royal ruched satin loin kilt around it. Congal had made for a sovereign and gave him at the Battle of Moira that day for overthrowing the army of L.L. Phelan, Olive of Keady, and a lilac purple inner tunic layer, coloured with warp close, strip selvage, well plate woven, with delight beautiful findrinny gold burnished, in layers of dear smooth gemstones of carbuncle mesh husk, from one head end of that strip selvage to the other, with arch billow loops of silk velveteen over smooth shining stud bead buttons to rally damn close and open it, and a glebe cutting trout speckling variegation of all white bright money silver, every which way, and every haven journey way past he went, and a needle narrow, spear point hard on that inner layer tunic, 2 exceedingly long, broad, flat surface splinter spears in his hands, a speckled trout cock's yellow buffalo horn bugle, corniculated wing shield on his top vine back, and a fist golden glaive sword on his left chest side. Just to finish, this is a poem called Long Lines, which is very specifically local. It's about the combination of seeing a photographic exhibition in the local hotel in the island where we live, and also coinciding with me listening into a meeting of the local mooring committee for the boat owners in the village. Long lines. They'd all have cleared and ploughed and harrowed up and down, and sown and spread in turn, each lot of tacked in-by, outrun, drill and rig in their own townships, and been around the headlands of the Horn and Hope, in the image here from way back when the burns, black as the stick, were full of salmon and brown trout and ling and char, fairly abounded, and a man could walk, they say, across the beach, then the Dorney and the Sound, on the decks of brigs and gigs, cots, creelers, cutters, drifters, gabberts, luggers, merchantmen, pinnaces, smacks, scows, skiffs, tramps, tugs, yawls and yoles, and the frigates, big liners and tall ships, passing, and tenders and old wrecks from the pier, on the island straight over to the cliff fall, and fixed light on the shore and Ben Screel on the far side. Today, at first light, the back of 6 in the morning, in the light mist, hail and rain, the flag on the slipway down at half-mast, Tibrach and Loch Carron, and all the flights of migratory terns and herring gulls, following them near astern, as if they were a John Deere or Ferguson or a White Clydesdale or Garran, with McInnes and MacLeod and their ancient landcraft in their hands, are the last pair to keep going out still. They shift gear and bail out and cast off with their long lines and deep lines and bag nets and darrows and light out on the slack tide, dragging and hauling on the ropes, letting go of an endless chain. Good Margie. Capoid. Thanks very much.
More than time, thank you.
So it was just a wonderful triangulation of languages: English, Gaelan, Scots Gaelic, and we will thank the Colmkill Foundation for their support in bringing that trifecta before us tonight. Thanks, guys. An bhar fad, when it's on us, agus Tosulagum, Gorman Shivsha Tanavas and Taspontis version. So we'll move on now to the final participant in this session, Vona Groarke. And Vona is one of the most significant poets the island has produced in the past number of decades. So we're delighted to welcome her here via Zoom tonight. She's published, give or take, 10 collections of poetry, I think now, that exhibit an extraordinary range from fragile haiku-like presences to more stately stanzaic forms with impregnable sonorities. It's a range that takes in crisp individual lyrics to more complex experimental narrative sequences. Perhaps there's a true line from Rody's performance to Vona's, given that she also has translated texts from the early and indeed early modern Irish canon. Vona has been garlanded with any number of awards and laurels, too many for me to mention. Suffice to say that she is currently writer in residence at St. John's College, Oxford, which is pretty fancy. And we'll welcome her here tonight, fluttering like spindrift over the internet into Nanonagle Place. So, Corgi Fáilte Inishre Vona Groarke Lerol.
Nílach bearlágam tá náir orm ará is Gaeilge manscoil atágam. So all my poems are in English, but I really enjoyed that reading, and thank you so much to Rody and to Alistair for that, and thank you, Billy, for that really kind and generous introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be part of the festival. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. It's a bit odd to be coming to this festival in particular from Cambridge in England. I come from a different place, and so I thought that I would start maybe by coming from a different time as well, and thinking about time. And Billy mentioned their translations, and so I wanted to start with the start of a version that I did of a poem that is 250 years old this year, and it is, as many of you will know, this poem has been in the news this year. It's the Lament for Art O'Leary, and it was actually not that it was November in 1773. It was, no, sorry, it wasn't. It was earlier in the year. It was May. That Art O'Leary was killed, and that Eileen Duffy O'Connell, his wife, who was a grandaunt of Daniel O'Connell from the O'Connell clan of Derrynane, who had defied her family's wishes by marrying Art O'Leary. But this poem is a poem that she intoned over the dead body of her husband after he had been murdered by the local sheriff, by the sheriff's men, Abraham Morris's men. And we know it in Irish, in that we all, well, I don't know actually if they learn it anymore in school, but certainly I learned it in Irish in school and had that kind of 3-beat line on Gaeilge sort of well implanted in my brain. And one of the things you'll notice when I read to you the start of this is that it doesn't have a 3-beat line in English, because English doesn't like a 3-beat line. It sort of becomes very mechanical after a short time. So anyway, here you are. This is my version of it. I've already admitted that I don't have great Irish, and you might be thinking, well, what's she doing translating Irish poems then, canonical Irish poems? And I'll put my hand up and say that what I've done with this, and with something else I'll read you in a while, is that I've worked from English versions. So I'm not working directly from the Irish. What I'm doing is taking the Irish and then taking all the kind of rivulets into English that have happened. Not that that mattered anyway. You led me through rooms that whitened as we walked, had a blaze of comfort stoked for me whenever I desired. You shook out your house for me, had bedrooms chastened and kitchens stacked. You had mackerel hooked for me, lambs fattened on silky grass for me, loaves shaped like the sun and moon for me, and women on hand to see to it all, to pour and knead and clean. All I had to do was turn over in my hand-spun nets of sleep. My dear, I picture you with sunlight tied around your head like a band of gold, every crease and angle of you, from your silver-hilted sword to your fine-trimmed mount, a compliment to that spring day and what it had to offer you. Even the English lowered their eyes from the vision of you on your foreign horse. Not that that mattered in the end. It wasn't their eyes that undid you. You were every inch the heir of the Earls of Antrim and the upright Barrys of Immokalee, but you were still the footloose suckling calf that had warmed my breast that morning. My white-gloved horseman, I'd have watched you forever in your cambric and laces, your worsted and leather, your hand-stitched shoes and your Austrian breeches that showed off your sleek, powerful thighs astride the brown mare that was a match for you in vigour and elegance. My art, I wouldn't give the time of day to rumour of your death until that self-same mare of yours came to me with her bridle awry, her withers smattered with your heart's damson, and the polished saddle where I last saw you bolt upright, lopsided and bereft. My first spurt took me clean over your side of the bed, the second got me to the gate, the third up on her back. I slapped my hands to set her going, and she took off at a heedless pace that didn't spill 1 second until she carried me to the single furze where your dear body slumped. That's just from the opening passage of it, which is, as I say, in the voice of Eileen Dovney Connell. There are some other parts of it that have been attributed to Art's sister and also to Art's father, but that's the bit I chose to read to you just to open up this evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, thank you. All right. Because it's a little odd, this whole Zoom thing, I thought I'd read you a poem. Now, I think I wrote this round about 2004. So technology was not quite the same then as it is now. But it's a poem about technology, and it's a poem about being away from a situation that you'd rather actually be there physically to partake in. But the best you can manage is being there in the instance of this poem, being there by Skype. It mentions Bebo, which back in 2004 or so was all the rage. And my kids, who were then maybe 9 and 8, were well into Bebo. This was an aspect of their lives, the way I suppose Instagram is now, or whatever has come after that, which I don't know about, for young people now. So nobody knows about Bebo anymore. We've kind of forgotten about it, and I wonder if really it only exists in the sort of the archives of technology companies, and maybe even in this poem. And it does mention Skype, and it does mention Google Earth, which will probably in the end go the same way as Bebo. I should say I was in America and my kids were in Manchester in England. Away. I babysit by Skype, breakfast to their lunch, lunch to their dinner. I straighten uniforms, ask French, nag music practice, argue friends, trim their Bebo access. I touch their silky faces on my screen. I am 3,000 miles ago, 5 hours in the red. What would it take? One cross cyber wire, a virtual hair's breadth awry, for these synapsed hours to bloat to centuries, for my background to be rescinded to a Botticelli blue, my webcam image roughed and pearled, speaking vintage words into spindrift, or, failing that, for me to be headlonged into light years off to the room of an obsolete laptop where I Skype and no one answers, where I Google Earth to see if the world name checks this morning, my son's bike in the garden, my daughter's skirt on the line. Okay. I wanted to read for you another translation. So in August of this year, I brought out this book, if you can see it there. It's called Woman of Winter, and it's a version of the Lament of the Haggard Bear. So I thought it would have a kind of a relevance to this festival. And the Lament of the Haggard Bear is a 9th century poem by Anon. Of course, it wasn't by Anon, but we don't know who wrote it. And we don't, interestingly enough, we don't know if it was a man or a woman who wrote it. And different scholars have different views on that and look for different clues to try and ascribe it. But it's impossible to do it because really we know this poem through its 16th and 17th century iterations as well. It exists in the Old Irish, but it's the version that we have of it is copied in the 16th century initially, and then from there on it has a more sort of trackable existence, and that manuscript is in the Royal Irish Academy. And the first English translation of it appeared, so far as I can ascertain, in the early 20th century by Kuno Meyer. And I first came upon it in a little anthology called the Penguin Book of Irish Poetry, which was a book mostly of English poetry, in fact, and Brendan Kennelly had a version of the Haggard Bear in it. And I guess I read it when I was about 18 or so, and at the time I was very struck by the poem. Its strangeness, the fact, although I may not even have had the language to describe this, but the fact that it was in the voice of a woman, and that this voice was coming from a place that I wasn't usually looking for women's voices in. And it kind of stayed with me. The poem stayed with me for a long, long time. And since coming to Cambridge in October of last year, this is a place where one of the really great scholars of Old Irish works, Moira Ní, and there are a number of Irish manuscripts held in the libraries here. So I started thinking about it a little bit more. And with Moira's encouragement, I had a go at making a version of it. And again, I want to emphasize that it's not a literal translation. I don't have the Irish to do that. But what I'm doing is trying to take this voice that comes to us from the 9th century and trying to write it into, I guess, the language and experience of a contemporary woman who is also growing older, because the poem is about the experience of growing older in a woman's body. And it came out, as I say, in August, and it's got illustrations by Isabel Nolan, black and white drawings inside, and a really lovely colour cover illustration. And I'm delighted to have been able to work with Isabel on it. And what's really interesting to me, and what I learned so much from Isabel about, was that her drawings are also translations. So she takes initial sources in various manuscripts, not all of them Irish, and she makes translations of those drawings into the drawings that she uses for this book. Okay, so if you know anything about the Lament of the Hag of Bear, probably the one thing that you will know is that it's got a lot of water imagery. And she talks about the tide an awful lot, and she talks about the tide going out, which is a euphemism for growing older. So, of course, there are some things when you're working with a version or a translation, there are some things that you feel you can adapt, and there are some things that are like an url or like a baseline that are just absolutely bedrock to the work that cannot be interfered with. So you'll hear that tide coming in and going out in my version of it. So I'll read you a couple of bits from it. This is from the start. The tide has well and truly turned, and not in my favour, but as much use to whinge about that as to beg honey of the sea. I am the old woman of Bear, whose gown used always to be new, but now I'm worn thin as threadbare cloth, my bare bone life pokes through. All for money is the way of you lot, not so when I was young, giving the glad eye to the world and the nod to many a man. All for credit is the way of it now, bragging and clamour, airy as plains we'd ride over once, wind in our mouths, no big talk stoppering us. Full of the big talk these days are, for what's given and the worth of it, puffed up so you'd take telling for gift if you didn't know any better. Back then we rode over sands like wind, every horse a steed, every race a prize, a flood of reward from my king of kings into my open arms. Arms that are hollow now, twig thin, good for stoking darkness only, that used to kindle a wealth of kings back in my young day. Look at them, like winds in winter. What young man would step warmly in? Not that I'd raise them to any man now, whatever the longing in me. I see girls brimful of May, but what is May to me, whose days are a hollowing one by one, and nights a winnowing? No sweet nothings in my ear, no feasts laid on for me, no ribbons or jewels in the tatty hair I tie up in any old scarf. Do I mind? Oh, but that same hair had sun and moon in it once, when I used to be downing nights the way I down draughts of ale. So the poem progresses, and there's quite a bit of this byplay between a sense of loss and a sense of resentment, and a little bit of kind of bitterness at young people who are enjoying being young when she is not in a position to do that anymore. And then comes this idea of religion. And the reason I wanted to have a go at making a version of the Lament of the Hag of Bear is because it seemed to me that people were far too quick to send her off to the nunnery, to make a nun of her. And in fact, several people have translated her as the Nun of Bear. And there's actually very little textual evidence for this in the Old Irish. Mostly it comes from a kind of a mistranslation, not quite a mistranslation, but a very loose translation into English as a veil of a word that doesn't necessarily mean that in Irish. And so I've translated that as a scarf, because I'm not sending her to the convent. I don't see why she should have to go to the convent. I think she can be rueful, and she can experience a sense of loss, and she can think about her body without having to necessarily turn all of this into an acceptance of religion. So I suppose that's the new thing that I've brought to the poem. So I'm just going to read you a bit from the end of it now, where she's thinking about the future. And I should show you, if I can get it to line up, I can show you Isabel's drawing there. So this is her at the end when she's been through all of this, thinking about her body and the changes that have happened to it, and the loss of status, and the loneliness of that are involved in becoming older. And I don't think these things are necessarily irrelevant to the current time. I'm nearly there. The rain is peeling off letter by letter, whatever mark I made on the life I had. Not much to show for myself in the end, who used to be all show, my gist unlaced and open to whoever would lay words of love, or even half love, out for me, that I used to hoard and store dry in my larder, just as if they'd been sustenance and real. Of course, I learned the way we learn, that love plays out in shadow talk until you can't tell light from dark in a room with one black window only. And no point in the fighting of it, for you'd as well pick a quarrel with the sea that has no mercy in it. Gone from me, my world of worlds, the day I loved and the day I didn't. Not long, either of them, now I look back, not long at all in the end, but lovely too, sweet as the sea on a May afternoon, when the tide, coming in just as far as it comes, slips away off quietly. Sometimes you can only figure out what it is that you've been doing when you look back. And I made this translation over the course of last winter. And I called it Woman of Winter because it took me a winter to write it, but also, more importantly, because it seemed to me that old age, or certainly the old age that this woman from Beara was describing, was a wintry old age, and there's quite a lot of references to winter seas and winter landscapes and so on. And as I say, there was no way I was going to call her a nun, and there was certainly no way I was going to call her a hag. So I called her a Woman of Winter. And it was only, I suppose, after the book had been published that I realized that this theme of old age had been, I won't say weighing on my mind, but that it was something that I suppose I had been thinking about before ever I undertook to do this translation. And I think this translation is sort of a strong iteration of that preoccupation. But in the book that I published in 2019, Double Negative, looking back on it and looking back on this poem that I'm going to read you, which is an attempt to try and find a set of images that equate to the experience of growing older, and a kind of a very loose narrative for the idea of leaving your youth and moving off into something that is a little more uncertain, let's say, a little more challenging. That's really what I was trying to do, 6, 7, 8 years ago when I was writing this poem. And I didn't realize that there was a kind of a thread. I thought when I came upon this idea of doing the version of Woman of Winter, I thought that I was doing something I'd never done before. And it's only looking back I realized that this was something that was kind of running underneath quite a bit of work that I've been doing for a while back. So I'll read you this one then, which, as I say, is much more interested in how to find images that seem to describe the experience of getting older. It's called The Old Country. I came out of that country with one suitcase crammed with newspaper, seeds in every fold. No, that's not it. No seeds and no newspaper. My suitcase was full of snow and the shadow of snow, which is another way of saying it was full of lies. I had been there for years, whole months of them, and then, just like that, words stopped calling on me. Street signs flipped inside out. My neighbours swapped faces. The blue door was by nightfall paler blue. On clean days, hail pockmarked the pillows. I try not to picture it, or to calculate heartbeats. Blood I bled, rooms undressed, ways of waking up, ounces in an ounce of love. I am scattering ink-white ashes as I write. Sometimes you live a day, so it passes through you like a ghost on the landing. And sometimes I think there is no landing, and the ghost cannot be me. So you might get a sense from that I have a kind of an interest in, I suppose, what, for lack of a better word, I might call surrealism, and trying to figure out how you can use surrealism to cover a bit of poetic ground, so that it doesn't have to always be a poem that starts at A and works through the various stages and ends up at the end point. Because to be honest, that sort of narrative poem is not that interesting to write, to me anyway. Instead, I want to come at odd angles. I want to interrupt the narrative. I want to kind of make it swerve. I want to make it think about what it's doing. And so I'm going to read two poems that were, I guess, really about COVID. I'm trying to find a way to describe the experience of lockdown, of that time when we were alone, if we were alone, and just trying to find visual equivalents for the experience. So the two poems are kind of companion pieces, but one of them is a little more literal. So the basis of the first one, which is called Jar, the basis of it is that time that we lost in lockdown is like a jar, an empty jar. Okay, so that's a fairly standard, fairly solid proposition. And then, because I was a bit dissatisfied with that, I thought, well, okay, how will I come at this a bit more strangely, in a way that might represent the strangeness of the experience? Because it was, I think, we would have no problem in agreeing, a very, very strange experience, even if it was quite manageable or quotidian on a day-to-day basis. The sort of the bigger picture, the sense of what was at stake and the fear of it, I think, made it a very strange experience. So the first poem is a fairly straightforward metaphor, and then the second one is trying to get at something of the same experience, but through a more surrealistic way. The first poem mentions the Koh-i-Noor, which is, I think, in the parlance of the diamond trade, it's a bloody big rock. Jar. The unused year has been upended like an old jam jar, so all its gewgaws and mementos clatter to the floor. The time you were due in such a place, the visit that wasn't, the loved one not seen. Just a few small shiny things, once fingered as if they were, each of them, the Koh-i-Noor. Here they are, strewn just as they fell, with the light of morning, see it now, cupping them, their gist and cast, as if it were a face, as if it were a hand on a face, and the face were yours. I put the jar back where it used to be, before ever I found it for this. I let it fill with rain, and then I tip it out again. Have we found a use for it yet? Let's place it for show up on the high shelf. Call it a jar like any old jar, only perfect, of its kind. Quarantine. World dropped by at 3 a.m, kissed my eyelids, stroked my hair, said, there, you're not alone. I have other calls to make tonight, and every cell of skin I touch, I will ask to remember you. And the wind said, shh, through the keyhole, and the rain said, hush your lies. But I wasn't listening in the least. With my hands brimful of stars. Okay, I'm going to finish with the poem that, what's really one of the really lovely things about this festival is the poems that have been put out in the landscape. And when Paul asked me if I had a poem that I could do this, that he could do this with, I was really delighted to offer up this one, which is on show, out, as I say, out in the open, as it were, which is an interesting place for lyric poems to be. It's called the copybook, and some of you will remember these copybooks that were, I suppose, in business long time ago. Well, when I was in primary school, Ashling copybooks, and you might remember some of the iconography. They were Ashling copybooks, so they were made by an Irish company, and they had various sort of imagery that was to do with Irishness on the cover. So there was there was a round tower with a swallow, and there was some other bits and pieces anyway. And I've put some of that into this poem, and it's a kind of a sonnet. It's sort of a sonnet because now there's no need to go into all that now. But anyway, the copybook. We learned to write in Ashling copybooks, salmon pink or mossy green, with either a fountain pen on the front cover or a round tower over which a single swallow was caught in the act of circling or alighting. Who could tell? Perched in its green sky, in its black outline, above the tower, which was also black, and gave no hint of the stowed gold or frightened monks inside. One was ruled, the other not. One was for Irish, English, history and geography, the other sums, though that's where I put the poems, of course, small poems with red titles in the taut blue grid, like a page of slit windows crossed with iron bars. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for inviting me.
So it's the custom to conclude the readings with a brief Q&A. So because there's another session coming up, I'm going to confine myself to one question for each participant. But I'm going to try and make it a good question. So perhaps, Alistair, would you mind coming up and I'll ask you first? Gorman. So I've been reading a bit of Heidegger recently, and despite his odious politics, he writes very beautifully about dwelling and building. And I was going to ask you, where does your music dwell within the landscape? And as a secondary question, how does your own literary, or no, even literal dwelling place affect your musicianship?
Where to start? Well, I suppose, just like in Ireland, a lot of the tunes in Scotland are actually associated with places themselves. A lot of the pipers would actually name their tunes after certain places, places that they were born in, places that they were raised in, or indeed things that happened over the years. So I've mentioned about the McCrimmons, for example, being these expert pipers hundreds of years ago. And they've left a massive amount of music to us, but one of the tunes that they left us was actually called Lament to the Children. And this was actually one of the pipers, had a massive amount of children, he had about 11 children, but they all died before him. And he composed this fantastic tune, this ancient melody tune, in their memory. And it's one of the great works of Scottish culture, but it's little known, to be honest, other than in piping circles. So it's Lament to the Children. In terms of where does music lie within me, I grew up listening to my father playing the pipes. My father was a piper as well. We were surrounded by music. So I used to hear these tunes growing up. And like many children growing up, I kind of resisted when he started to put the chanter into my hand and say, right, now it's time for you to learn. And I was like, I'm not doing that. I'm going out to play football or whatever, you know. And it was much later when I was actually, probably in my early teens, I became very aware of my own background. My father's side from Glen Shield, a very mountainous area, a very beautiful area, Kintail, but also my mother's side from the west of Ireland, from Mayo. And I kind of became aware that in our family, in our generation, my cousins and things, they weren't really keeping these traditions going, particularly Gaelic, for example, Scottish Gaelic. So I became very aware of my own kind of background and identity. And I still can remember there was a turning point where suddenly, it was almost like a switch went on. And I thought, I need to kind of start to embrace this and start to take this on and learn the pipes, in fact. And so, as I said earlier on, a man called Tony McDonald taught me. And so I went to see him for lessons. And it's given me a lot in my life, to be honest. It's been a great privilege in some respects to be playing in places like tonight. It's got me into lots of places you'd never get into without having that skill, if you like, or that experience. So it's part of me, very much so. And interestingly enough, I'm now in the situation where my son Seamus is wanting to go and play football. And I'm trying to put the chanter in his hand, you know. But he's actually resisted it. But just last week, he turned up to me and said, Dad, would you mind teaching me the chanter? So whilst I'm in Ireland, actually, we've been doing these kind of Facebook calls and that, and he's showing me how he's managed to get his fingers on the chanter and blow it. So fingers crossed, we'll see if we can get one more generation out of us. Thank you very much.
So, Rody, an Raifáin seo agus cuireadh mé ceistbháin sa freisin. So, Rody, I'll start with a very easy question for you. What are words? Okay, I'll take it down a bit. You're speaking about your intertonguing and your focus on the individual linguistic element, right? The slightest words and how they yield up so much. I wonder if I could ask you to speak about that, and when did you start to zero in so closely on individual words? And just,
Yeah.
go with that. Yeah.
Can I just say first, thank you very much, Vona. That was great. What was your question again, Billy? Okay, words. What are words? That's a good question. They're devices, and they're sort of symbols. I suppose in the specific case of me introducing this slightly whimsical stratagem of intertonguing was out of more pragmatism, really, than conviction. Now, we know in Ireland that publishing monolingually in the Irish language is the norm for Irish language books. It's not the norm in the case of Scottish Gaelic in Scotland, certainly in the case of verse or poetry, anyway, possibly less so in the case of prose. But it was the fact that I suppose I did feel a slight resentment that it was imposed upon me and expected of me that any work I produced in Gaelic would perforce be then translated in a version of English, which I found almost universally inadequate in my own case, and in a lot of other cases as well. That a lot of the nuance of the language just simply wasn't represented in the translation. And as I mentioned before, sometimes a choice, a lexical choice, which is semantically sound, didn't really adequately represent the totality of the space that that individual word was occupying. And something I should have mentioned earlier is that in some of the interchanging versions that you heard tonight, you may have noticed that some of them were phonemic representations into English to add another dimension, as well as the semantic, having a phonemic representation to add to the possibilities of a single word. Now, I think I've also come to the conclusion that what I'm doing is not actually poetry. Why are you laughing? I think it's a linguistic stratagem born out of necessity in the first instance, but something I developed in a pretty idiosyncratic sort of way. You've set me thinking now, Billy, about my whole opus. About that Robin Williams throwing a final draft of his final play into a waste paper basket, saying, "Au revoir, Uve." I'll tell you what, when you buy me a pint later, we'll discuss it further.
Gormaga, Rody. And Vona, if you can hear me clearly, my question for you is as follows. Form. Like Auden said, all poems arise from, well, Auden loved dualities, but he said all poems arrive, and binaries, but all poems arrive from a form in search of an idea or an idea in search of a form. And I was thinking about, when you were speaking tonight, about the way that the 3-beat line doesn't work in English, and in your description of your collection Double Negative, which you referenced, and your collection that came after that, Link, Poet and World, they all involve forms going beyond not merely just received forms that exist in the local level, but also the form of the book or the form of the translation, or indeed the form of the line. And I was wondering if I could invite you to speak about that a little.
Sure. Yeah, I'm very committed to trying to make every book that I write different to the previous book that I've written. So how do you do that? Because I've only I am a lyric poet, so I am working off experiences that I have had. I'm grounded in the personal, I'm grounded in the life that I live, and I'm trying to apply language to that experience, which I think is the essence of the lyric project. So I only have a limited set of experience. You wouldn't believe how limited my set of experience feels like at this stage of my life. So how do I make it new? And my answer to that is to try and think of how it becomes new, rather than where it comes from being new, because I don't think that's likely to happen. Well, I kind of hope it won't happen, because if it does happen, it'll be new in ways that I might not necessarily want. So leaving aside the idea of the source material being novel or being, tricky in some way, then it's what you do with it. That's where the novelty has to happen. So every book I write, I'm trying to think of ways of using form to mine the material so that it won't sound or be or look like what I've written before. Now, that's not to say that I'm always writing the same book, just it seems a little bit different. It's not quite that, but it's that by thinking more about form each time, I think I write a different kind of poem. So the last, before Woman of Winter, the book before that was a book called Hereafter, which was I guess the fashionable term for it now is a hybrid book, because it's got lyric poems, and it's got kind of folk sonnets, and it's got prose, and it's got images in it. And all of these elements together are telling the story of somebody who left Ireland in the 1880s and went to New York and worked as a domestic servant in New York. And it's kind of telling her life story, or what can be accessed of her life story, but also trying to think about on the surface of the page, not buried beneath the surface, but right there on the surface, the language is constantly saying, how am I going to tell the story? Why am I using these different forms? Why am I using prose here and kind of this sort of folk sonnet here and lyric poetry over there? What's the interaction? What's the dynamism? What's the energy between them? And asking the language to think about that, and therefore in its thought process to try and work out different forms, for me was the I guess the charm of the engagement. It's what kept the project alive for me over the 3 years that I was writing and editing the book. So you're right, I think, Billy. I'm very, very committed to the idea of finding new forms, or of trying to make each poem, even if it is, like that example I showed you of coming at the subject of aging through translation, and then reading you a poem that wasn't a translation, but that was an original poem in English, but that's trying to come at the same subject matter just through a different angle, through a different kind of side-on way. But insofar as I will be able to keep writing poems, so far as I will find poems that feel to me like they need to be written, I think they will be thinking for sure about form and about how they can make material new through new uses of form.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Vona. Great answer. So we'll finish up this session, and there will be another session coming up shortly after. So can we have one more round of applause, please, for Rody, Alistair and Vona?
No, it's fine. Stand back a bit. Yeah, if you're there and if you see it going into the red, just give me a signal. Do you want to check it now? Or we can check it in a while. What's that's a 58 and that's for the online, is it? There. I'll be there. And it's half an hour, isn't it? So I have a story, an Irish language poem and a story. No, and they're short. If after the first one, I've two 10-minute stories and I have an Irish language poem going between. Yeah. And I'm on second. If the Zoom, San Francisco Zoom is first. So I'll just sit down there. And was she in the films this morning, Michelle? Yeah, I might run out for a coffee. Is there tea or coffee here, or will we run out for? Will be somewhere on Dublin Street, or?
I don't know, you might get one in Novecento.
Huh?
You might get one in Novecento.
Yeah.
The one out the front door, down to the right, you can see it in Novecento.
Okay, we'll go there. Okay, thanks.
One, two, check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 more? Or is that enough? Hello?
Yeah.